All right. Good evening, everyone. I will continue to admit if people show up. Welcome to March of 2023. We will have regular season baseball in 29 days. So yay for us. I don't have any other administrative announcements except to for anybody who is planning on doing an article for the next edition of the CHOP needs to be in to Ruth by the end of March. Other than that, we will be doing obviously our monthly meetings, Peeps at the Peeb, that we do on Monday, first Wednesday of the month. And starting this month, we will be doing our Baltimore Baseball Babble on the last Sunday of every month through November. So I ask that everybody mute except for those who are speaking. And we'll get started here. Obviously, a lot of you guys already know Barry. He's been writing about baseball for more than 50 years. His first article was published in July 1970 issue of Baseball Digest. He's a freelance writer, and his articles have been published in more than 70 national and regional publications. He's the author of 4 books, including Frank Home Run Baker, the World Series hero and Hall of Famer. Excuse me. His latest book, The Search for the Next Mickey Mantle, from Tom Tresh to Bryce Harper, was published by Sunbury in last November. It takes a look at the dynamic challenges players who were labeled as the next Mantle face trying to meet the intense pressure and high expectations of the media and fans. 16 players are featured in the book. I'll mention just a few. Robbie Mercer, Clint Hurdle, Kirk Gibson, Jay Buhner, Greg Jeffries, Bryce Harper, and Mike Trout. And the first chapter in the book is on Mantle himself. I believe he's joining us live from York, somewhere in that region, Pennsylvania. So Barry, you can take it over from here.
Well, Peter, thanks for the opportunity, and it's really my pleasure to be here tonight. And I wanted to talk about the book, The Search for the Next Mickey Mantle, from Tom Tresh to Bryce Harper. And like all books, it has a germ of a beginning. And when I was 13 years old, I remember Tom Tresh being voted the Rookie of the Year in 1962. And during the off season, myself and many other baseball fans started to read articles that were titled, Tom Tresh, Is He the Next Mickey Mantle? And of course, Tom Tresh did not become the next Mickey Mantle, nor did a long string of other players that were tabbed as the next Mickey Mantle. So I wondered about that, and I wondered, why was that? And admittingly, the expectations were often unrealistic, but I wanted to know, how talented were the players? Did they really get an opportunity? Were they managed correctly? How much did the pressure of being the next Mickey Mantle affect them? And as I tried to read about these players in the beginning, what I would read would just be maybe a few cursory paragraphs about them, but little explanation as to why they didn't succeed to the level that people thought that they should. So that's what really I wanted to try to do in the book, is to show the pressure that they were under and how much that affected them. And for all these players who, they were talented, and like I say, some had average careers, some had mediocre careers, some were complete busts, and a couple will be going to the Hall of Fame. But they all had talent, and this next Mickey Mantle label was an albatross for all of them. And to all nobody ever asked to be labeled the next Mickey Mantle. And in almost every case, the player was quick to tell the media and the fans, hey, I'm not the next Mickey Mantle. But the media did not want to listen. They wanted to promote the player as the next Mickey Mantle. Now, Mantle, as I say in the book, is the gold standard of the superstar. I mean, he's playing in the media capital. He's playing for the world champion Yankees. He has some charisma, and he was a big creation of the New York media. That's one thing that we probably, as young fans growing up, we probably didn't realize as much. But anyway, Mantle, to his credit, would tell the players, "Hey, you can't be me, just be yourself." And I thought that was very helpful at what he tried to do. So um, the Yankees particularly were under a lot of pressure to come up with the next Mickey Mantle. They had 40 years of superstars: Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle. Now, the Yankees nor their fans were ready for that to end. But could they come up with somebody like that? The Yankees, were in decline in the mid to late 60s. In 1966, they finished in last place for the first time since 1912. They lost a lot of their stars to either retirement, trades. A number of their players were injured. Jim Bouton, Jim Stafford were two pitchers that had a couple good seasons, but because of injuries and probably mismanagement by the club, they did not do very well after that. Plus the fact that the Mets came on the scene in '62, and they started to steal attendance away from the Yankees, and the Yankees saw their attendance decline. So all these were signals that the Yankees needed to do something. Now, the Yankees had a multitude of problems that would be harder to fix than if they could come up with a five-tool player like Mantle, because as I said, when you have somebody who's supposed to be the next Mickey Mantle, supposed to be a superstar, well, your fans have hope. You have a marketing tool. You have an attendance magnet. You have something you can really promote. So the Yankees were really looking for that. And so some of the players of the 60s from the Yankees in particular, you had Tom Tresh, Joe Pepitone, Roger Repose, Bobby Mercer, Steve Whitaker, Bill Robinson, Tony Sausalito, Ron Blumberg. That's a pretty long line of players for the Yankees that were supposed to be the next Mickey Mantle. And of course, none of them were. Maybe Bobby Mercer might have been closest to it. And then in the 90s, you had Ruben Rivera, who a lot of fans may not remember unless you're really a diehard Yankee fan. So the other thing, when I talk about the pressure and the high expectations on these players, is that Fred Lynn said, my expectations were already high, but the expectations of the fans were even higher. And Bob Tewksbury, who is former major league pitcher and was a mental skills coach for 3 major league teams, wrote a book called 90% Mental. And he says that expectations are one thing, and the fans' expectations. The player can set goals, and if a player sets a goal, he can adjust those goals up or down. But when fans and the media set expectations, they seldom adjust them. And in many cases, the fans and the media kind of delight in the failure of guys that were touted to be the next superstar. So even though these guys never asked for it or anything else like that. So a lot of these players, particularly in the 60s and 70s, um, didn't have the benefit of what players have today, which is a sports psychologist or mental skills coach. And I feel very sorry for these players. And I think many of the chapters in the book are kind of sad, because when you see what the pressure that these players were under, how much the clubs tinkered with them, and this happened to a lot of players, that they tried to make uh, the players into something that they weren't. And then the players kind of thought that's what they should be. Tom Tresh is a good example. Um, Tresh in his first 3 years, very, very successful, um, played well in the World Series. Um, and then that was 62, 63, 64. And then the Yankees started to lose some of their star power, and Tresh didn't have that lineup uh, that could help him out. And he started to think that he could hit 35, 40 homers a year, because that's what people had been telling him. And he tried to do that, and he completely screwed his swing up. And that led to a lot of different problems for Tresh. Give you an example of how wrong people can be. Clint Hurdle, it came up, and he was on the cover of, I think it was the 1978 Sports Illustrated, and he was called the can't miss kid. And he was 20 years old. Bill Fisher, who was the scout that signed Clint Hurdle, said Clint will hit 25 to 40 homers a year and bat for a high average. Well, in an 11-year career, Hurdle hit 32 home runs. So the can't miss kid missed in a way on that. But Whitey Herzog, the manager, and Charlie Lau, the hitting coach, were at odds about Clint Hurdle. Herzog wanted him to be a home run hitter. Charlie Lau thought he was more of a line drive hitter and could hit for a high average. Well, Whitey Herzog won that battle because he fired Charlie Lau, and then Hurdle tried to pull everything and become the home run hitter, and again screwed up his swing, was sent to the minors. And Hurdle only played 2 full seasons in the majors, and by the age of 24, the Kansas City Royals had given up on him, and they traded him to the Cincinnati Reds. And he went to the Reds, and he was glad to go there to get away from the pressure of Kansas City. And the Reds said, well, we have no expectations for you. We just want you to go out and play. And he had a horrible spring training in the first 2 weeks of the season. And within 2 weeks of the start of the season, he was on the bench and eventually sent to the minors and all. So it's things like that that you don't realize at times that are exerting on the player. And Jim Hawkins, the Detroit sports writer, said about Clint Hurdle, and I think this applies to a lot of the players, is that the fans never forgave him for being human. And I think that's true. And so what happens when you have these high expectations is that players tend to try harder, like you and I would, and they lose sight of realistic goals. Their confidence is reduced. They have anxiety, fear of failure. They're overthinking. They have negative thinking. And most of these players had to handle all this on their own. They didn't have a mental skills coach, sports psychologist. And it wasn't until the late 1980s when the book about the mental side of baseball came out that teams started to stop ignoring the psychological aspect of players. And they started to bring on people to help them to deal with the expectations, to decrease their anxiety, to find ways to relax, to better practice, to do different exercises to help them. And so two of the most recent players who've been very successful are Bryce Harper and Mike Trout. And I think partly being in the age of mental skills coach and sports psychologist has helped them. But anyway, um, uh, that's a lot of the book is talking about why these players didn't become as successful as people thought that maybe they would. And I'd like to use an example that if I was going to be a rookie in the major leagues, instead of being Mickey Mantle at age 19, being in the media capital world, trying to replace Joe DiMaggio, trying to keep the Yankees as world champs, I'd rather be Ryan Mountcastle of the Orioles. In 2021, he played for the Orioles and they were 52 and 110. So not many people were paying attention to Ryan Mountcastle, right? And so what did he do? He hit 33 home runs, which is, I think, is the Oriole record, rookie record for home runs, and had 89 RBIs. A very, very good rookie season. But he did it pretty much under the radar. Think about Mantle being 19 years old. It's 5 years younger than what Ryan Mountcastle was. So there's a lot of that, that if you're flying under the radar, it's a lot easier. And just a couple other little examples. I have a chapter in about Bill Robinson, who started out with the Braves, played very briefly for the Braves, went to the Yankees. And so Bill Robinson, he kind of had the triple whammy. He was supposed to be the next Mickey Mantle. He was supposed to, he was black, so he was supposed to help raise the black race. And he was supposed to help the Yankees out of the depths of the basement. So in opening day in 1967, Bill Robinson hits a home run and against the Senators. And he said it was probably the worst thing that ever happened to him, because then he went into a 3-year slump. And as he said, he tried to hit a home run every time at bat to prove to the fans that he was worthy of being the next Mickey Mantle. And the pressure playing in New York was just so much for him. As he said, he couldn't wait to get out of the ballpark after a game. And once he got traded from the Yankees and got traded to the White Sox, actually, and he almost quit baseball because the White Sox put him in the minor leagues. But at that time, he talked to Willie Davis of the Dodgers, and Willie Davis told him, look, baseball's not my wife and it's not my life. So it's not the most important thing to me. So I don't really care. And saying that, yeah, he does care, but he's not walking up to the plate realizing that he's going to have to try to do everything. Bill Robinson accepted that philosophy, and only then did he start to become successful. And he had a very good career with the Phillies and the Pirates and things like that. So I want to do that as an intro, and then I can take some questions if you have them, and then I can talk about more specific players if you want me to do, but let's just see what questions you have. And then, like I say, I can add more as we go along. Any questions?
Guys, feel free to ask or put one in the chat if you don't want to ask it out loud.
Well, I have a question. Barry, maybe, well, who do you think comes closest to Mantle since his retirement?
Well, I don't think it's close. It's Mike Trout. Mike Trout is what I would say is the next Mickey Mantle. Trout has done things that are just unbelievable. I'm just trying to get some information about him here. Now, Trout's, he's a 3-time MVP. His WAR is, I think, 84. Mantle's was 110. Bryce Harper is like 42. Bobby Mercer is 32. So Mike Trout has been arguably the best player in the majors for the past decade. That's not me saying it. That's his peers saying it. I have a number of quotes in the book where people from Billy Bean to Jason Stark say that he, and Zach Greinke is in there, is that it's not even close what Trout has done in his first 5 seasons. He led the American League in WAR. In his first 7 seasons, he never finished lower than 4th in the MVP race. And I think that ties Yogi Berra. Now, the thing that, as we know, it hurts Trout is that very little national exposure. I mean, he's been in 1 playoff series. He was 1 for 12. And when Mantle was age 27, he had won 2 MVPs, back-to-back MVPs, had won a Triple Crown, had been in 6 World Series, had 9 home runs and 17 RBIs. So that Trout pales in comparison to Mantle when you talk about postseason. But as far as being the complete package, Trout has done it, and he has done it at a level that there's so many things that he is in an elite group of maybe 2 or 3 or 4 players of what he's been able to do. And now he's like 31, 32. So he's starting to decline a little bit, but he could very well end up with close to 100 WAR, if not more. So yeah, he's definitely what I would say is the next Mickey Mantle.
Yeah, he's really so far, thankfully, been able to overcome some of his injuries, and he even hit home runs in 7 straight games last year.
Right.
So it's good to see he came back after that last injury, and we'll see what happens.
And I'll tell you that he was drafted 25th, and so there were 2 teams that passed on him twice, and the other teams, all scratched their head about how did we miss Trout. And the Phillies assistant GM said, I think what we did is that we underestimated Trout's intangibles. Like we underestimated his competitiveness, his desire, his willing to work, his work ethic. There's also a thing that Trout probably had a anti-East Coast bias working against him when he was drafted, because he did not play when you're out in California or Florida, you play 100 games, and all like that. So he had a limited number of games. Scouts were very suspicious of the quality of competition that he played against. But the Angel scout who saw him said to a friend or another scout, he said, I think I have the next Mickey Mantle here. And he actually downgraded his scouting report on Trout because he didn't think that the home office would believe him. And but that's how high he was on Mike Trout. And And Mike Trout is certainly proven to be, like I say, the peers say, he is without a doubt, he's been the best player of the decade. Anybody else?
Yeah,
Well, let me,
just a second. Yeah, Tom here. I just posted in the chat. One of the things that's been said about Mike Trout is Bryce Harper was pretty famous for having got out of high school instead of graduating, got out early, and they was drafted at a very young age. And Trout, if people were checking his actual birth month, was practically a junior in high school when he was a senior in high school. And the age growth, of another year when you're 16, 17, 18 is huge. And that's also something that people now say they really.
and I think Tom froze up here. Anybody else? Okay, well, let me talk about a couple players who I say they're the saddest chapters in the book. And I say that because they probably squandered the most talent of any of the players. And that would be Joe Pepitone and Ruben Rivera. And Joe Pepitone, most people remember him particularly for his first couple of years. And Pepitone was highly touted when he came to the Yankees. He was signed when he was 17 years old. And this is kind of an interesting story, is that Joe Pepitone was fined by the Yankees before he ever played his first minor league game. And that's pretty hard to do. But Pepitone was in the hotel and they were playing a prank on the manager, and somehow the manager got sprayed with a fire extinguisher, and Joe was the culprit behind it. And he was fined $250, which was about 3 weeks' pay for him. But it was kind of like put up some red flags for the Yankees. But anyway, he was highly touted. They had some concerns about him in the minor leagues about not exerting himself too much in a pretty good nightlife. But he comes to the Yankees, and the Yankees actually end up trading Bill Skowron to the Dodgers because to make room for Joe. And Skowron had averaged like 27 homers and 80 some RBIs for 3 years. But one of the scouts said Joe will hit more home runs than Skowron ever hit. Plus, Joe was a very, very good defensive first baseman. But Joe was a slacker of the highest magnitude. He admittedly did not apply himself. And with Joe, it was all about potential, potential, potential. In 1969, Joe had been in the majors for 8 years. And he said, I'm going to start taking the game seriously now. This is 8 years in the majors. Arthur Daly, the New York Times, says Joe has wasted his talent prodigiously. Joe would say from time to time, usually when he signed a new contract or he was hitting the spring training, I'm going to give it my all this year. Well, he seldom did. He was more interested in being the next Warren Beatty or Frank Sinatra than he was the next Mickey Mantle. One time, a sports writer asked Roy Hamming, who was the Yankees GM, who would be the successor to Mickey Mantle. And Hamming said, Joe Pepitone, if his head stays the same size. Well, it shows you that Hamming kind of knew Joe. Because his ego was great. His nightlife was on a scale of 1 to 10 was probably 10. He got into all kinds of trouble. He always spent too much money he got, he owed money to mobsters. He had marital problems, all kinds of stuff. Joe, after the Yankees kept putting up with Joe because they thought he could help them win. When he finally got to the point that they realized he wasn't going to help them win, they traded him. And manager Ralph Houck had given him a number of warnings like, Joe, if you don't apply yourself, you're not going to be on the team very long. Well, they ended up trading him to the Houston Astros, and Harry Walker said, well, you know, there have been a number of players who were discontent with other teams, and they came here and they were fine. To which I said, Harry Walker had never met Joe Pepitone. And so very predictably, within a couple months, Joe had alienated the Astros and was looking to be traded. And then he goes to the Cubs, and he actually plays very well with the Cubs, but eventually alienates them. So Joe has the distinction of playing for 5 teams, 4 in the major leagues and 1 in Japan, and he walked out on all 5 teams. So I'm thinking that's probably a record. You're probably not going to find anybody that did that like Joe did. So in his autobiography called Joe, You Could Have Made Us Proud, I say to people, if you read it, it'll make you want to cry, because you realize how much talent Joe wasted. And a lot of players will say Joe Pepitone had Hall of Fame talent. People thought he could be one of the best hitters of all time. Now, in his book, Joe admits, you know, that he was a slacker, but he says he hit 219 career home runs. He should have hit 400. He batted 258. He should have batted 298. He said, all I had to do was to apply myself a little bit. And he didn't do that. Now, Ruben Rivera, is a player I didn't know much about before I started on the book. I'm not a diehard Yankee fan, but Ruben Rivera was as highly touted as any player. And I'm just going to get my sheet on Ruben Rivera here. And John Stearns, who managed Ruben Rivera in the Arizona League, said he's the best player I've seen in 22 years. He's a total package, including 40 home run power. Reggie Jackson said he's got everything. In May of 1995, Baseball America rated him #2 prospect in the country, only behind Alex Rodriguez. He was rated ahead of Chipper Jones, Derek Jeter, Shawn Green, Nomar Garcia-Parra, and Andruw Jones. He ended up playing 9 seasons for 5 teams, and he batted .219. Sports Illustrated called him one of the most overhyped busts of this generation. And one of the things about Ruben is that he was probably one of the most uncoachable players out there. Although he could hit, he had a great arm. He was a 5-tool player. He never seemed to be able to put it together, but he was a very immature player. He's the cousin of Mariano Rivera. He also enjoyed the nightlife quite a bit, and the Yankees actually hired a chaperone to be with Rivera, hoping to limit his nighttime activities. Reggie Jackson was kind of a mentor to Ruben Rivera, trying to help him and guide him and everything. And Ruben was plagued by a very high strikeout rate. He struck out about once out of every 3 times. And Ruben would always say, as he failed to improve, that his biggest problem was that he tried too hard. And most people didn't think that was true at all. They thought it was the reverse. He probably didn't try hard enough. So the Yankees, they thought Rivera and Jeter were going to be the keystones for the club for like the next 15 years. Well, Jeter was, but Rivera wasn't. So when they finally decided to give up on Ruben Rivera, they traded him to the Padres. Now, when he was with the Padres, Tony Gwynn was trying to work with him on hitting. And Tony Gwynn said, the guy doesn't want to spend time trying to get better. And Tony Gwynn pretty much gave up on him, which is a sad comment. Again, the Padres stuck with him because he was hitting 20 home runs a year, and they thought he had this 40 home run potential. And actually, the Padres traded Steve Finley. He might have left as a free agent, but anyway, Finley leaves, and that opens the starting position for Ruben Rivera. And Finley excels with Arizona. Ruben struggles with the Padres. The Padres, I think this is right. Yeah, the Padres hired Ben Ogilvy for a hitting instructor, specifically to work with Ruben Rivera. But that only lasted about half the season, and they ended up getting rid of Ben Ogilvy. And then the Padres sent him to the Cincinnati Reds, where he actually did pretty decent. And then he goes back to the Yankees, and he doesn't get to play with the Yankees because in spring training, he is accused of stealing Derek Jeter's bat and glove and selling them to a memorabilia dealer for like $2,500. Now, this is pretty strange actions for a guy who just signed $1 million contract with the Yankees. Well, this did not go over too well, to say the least, and the Yankees released him, and he ended up, he played for Texas and then I think San Francisco. But what's interesting is that as big of a bust as Ruben Rivera was, and I call him the colossal mystery, Brad Cashman, the general manager of the Yankees, said that Ruben Rivera is an example of what analytics would have prevented. And he said that if they were using the analytics back when he was with the Yankees and with the Padres, the analytics would have shown that he feasted on low quality pitching in the minors, and he was a high strikeout guy, and they probably would not have rated him as high as they did. But anyway, he's a sad story, and probably mainly to his immaturity and lack of coachability. But those are two guys who I think are among the saddest chapters in the book. Anybody have any other questions? And I have more I can talk about, but I wanted to open it up to any other questions if people have them. All right, let me talk a little bit about a guy that people know very little about. Now, I imagine that a lot of people would know Steve Whitaker's name. I know that I knew it, and as being a Next Mickey Mantle guy, but Whitaker plays part of, I think, something like he played 5 seasons in the majors and only 1 season where he played 100 games. And what's interesting about Steve Whitaker is the first time Joe DiMaggio saw Whitaker, it was in a training camp, and Whitaker was 18 years old. And Joe D looked at, I think it was Ralph Houck, and he said, "This kid can't miss. He has the perfect swing." And when they assigned Whitaker to a minor league team, the instructions were, do not mess with his swing, which is probably one of the few guys that that had those instructions with him about don't mess with his swing. They thought he had the perfect Yankee Stadium swing. Now, so why didn't Steve Whitaker make it? Well, Steve Whitaker, in the chapter, I call him the hot-tempered slugger. He had a temper that he couldn't control. And again, here's a good example. This guy could have probably benefited tremendously from mental skills coach or sports psychologist. But for some reason, Whitaker could not accept the fact of making an out. Now, you wonder, how do you play Major League Baseball if you can't accept making an out, when we know that if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you're going to be a pretty doggone good player. Well, when Whitaker got out, he would throw his bat, he would cuss, he would kick things, he just couldn't control himself. And as one of the guys said, that if Steve got a hit in his first at bat, then he might end up having a good day. But if he got out that first at bat, he'd probably have a terrible day. And Steve couldn't figure out how to control that temper. When he went to the Yankees, he got a shot at being a starter. And I think he hit like maybe 11 or 12 home runs the year he played 100 games. And so that was certainly below what he expected and what the Yankees expected. And the pressure really was too much for Steve. And so outside of being supposedly the next Mickey Mantle, I think they also gave him Roger Maris's number. And that was just, that was more than he could take in a sense. And then when the Yankees sent him to Syracuse, he went AWOL for 10 days. And so when he came back, they sent him somewhere else, but the handwriting was on the wall that Whitaker was going to be traded. And so the Yankees traded him to the Kansas City Royals, I believe it was. And the Yankee scout, Steve Sotko, I think it is, bet the general manager of Kansas City that Whitaker wouldn't last a year with the team because of his temper and attitude. Well, Kansas City ended up trading him to Seattle for Lou Piniella. And so Whitaker played about 60 games for Seattle, also went AWOL with Seattle, and they traded him. And long story short, that he retired at age 30, and his WAR was 0.1. And he said, you know, people take baseball seriously. I took it too seriously. And so it was probably a good example of somebody who could have benefited quite a bit from, like I say, that sports psychologist and everything. So how about I can talk about a couple other players, and I can also handle any questions. All right, let me do yeah,
Barry, do you have
Yeah.
anything on Roger Repos?
Yeah, sure. Roger Repos. This kind of shows you where the Yankees were, and like I say, trying to create the next Mickey Mantle, because Repos as a minor league hitter, um, didn't really attract much attention to the Yankees. He had a fairly high strikeout rate. He hit with some power, but nothing too impressive. But in 1965, with Toronto at AAA, he led the league in home runs with 12. That's in the first 57 games. And one of the Yankees in the front office said, Roger Repos is the next Yankee superstar. Well, thanks for the pressure. So Repos is now, they didn't want to call him up in 65, but Mantle and Maris, I believe, both were hurt, and they needed somebody in the outfield. So they called Repos up. Now he goes into a 10-game streak that is quite impressive. In those 10 games, he bats .372, hits 5 home runs, and drives in 10 runs. That's a pretty doggone good beginning. But then, of course, he cools off. And he goes in something like an 0 for 25 streak. And he looks very human. And so he plays a little bit in 65. And I believe in 66, he's actually hitting something like 343 in the first, I think, 30 games. But the Yankees are in need of pitching because Whitey Ford is hurt. And they trade Repos to Kansas City for, I think it was Fred Aker, pitcher. And so he goes to Kansas City, and he's hoping to get to play regularly. And but his time in Kansas City is short because the Kansas City drafts Rick Mundy, outfielder, and the next year they draft Reggie Jackson, outfielder. So that makes Repos expendable, and they send him to Oakland. Oh yeah, okay. So no, he's traded to Kansas City, then he goes to Oakland. And at Oakland, that's where they draft Rick Mundy and Reggie Jackson. So Oakland trades him to the Angels. And there with the Angels, he's a platoon player. So he never gets a chance to play every day, although he wants to play every day. And like a lot of these other guys, they believe they're everyday players, but they don't get that opportunity. And so Repos doesn't really do much with the Angels. He ends up going to Japan, where he has his best success. He plays 4 years there. He is quite a home run hitter in Japan. And he attributed a lot of the success in Japan to reading Ted Williams's The Science of Hitting. And he says, I wish I'd read that book a lot earlier. So, but anyway, he was not nearly as talented as what some of the other players were. Didn't quite get the chance that maybe he would have liked. We talk about being a platoon player, and that was partly the curse of Ron Blomberg too. And as I said, Blomberg should be known a lot more than just being the first designated hitter in baseball. He was, as a high school athlete, Blomberg was a high school All-American in baseball, football, and basketball. He actually had a scholarship to play basketball for UCLA and John Wooten. So again, they thought he was 35, 40 home run power with a pretty decent batting average. he was always a defensive liability. He ends up playing 8 years and hits a total of 52 home runs. Now, he was injured a lot. When he came to New York, he was a big fan favorite in New York, Jewish, and there are like 2.5 million Jewish people in New York, and they were all his fans. And he was very outgoing, liked to do community events. He loved to talk to the media, and that created a lot of resentment among his Yankee teammates. They're like saying, why is this guy always in the media? He hasn't done anything yet. And what hurt Bloomberg was when he was in the minors with Syracuse, the manager, and I think it was Lauren Babe at the time was the manager of Syracuse. I could be wrong on that, but decided to make him a platoon player. So as a left-hander, he would only play against left-handed pitching. And this really upset Bloomberg, who had not been a platoon player up to this point. And he said, look, if I am going to be a platoon player, I just soon not play baseball, because this is not my idea of being a baseball player. So one year, I believe it was in 73, somewhere in there, he was actually batting 400 in June. And it was like the latest anybody had batted 400 in a long time. And the Atlanta paper said, oh, Ron Bloomberg, is he the next 400 hitter? Which Bloomberg said, of course not. He said, you know it, and I know it. First of all, he was only batting against right-handed pitchers. How is that? Now, was he right-handed? Anyway, I believe he was right-handed. I don't know. Does anybody know if he was left or right-handed? I'll have to look that up. But anyway, he was only batting, he was a platoon player. And so he was batting 400. And the way he was going, he would not get a chance to even get enough at bats to qualify for the batting type. And of course, the other teams were pretty smart too. And so Bloomberg was left-handed, and so they would start their left-handers and keep, and the Yankees would be forced to keep Bloomberg on the bench. And so that really hurt him, and he was not very happy about that. So then he goes through a series of injuries. He blows out his shoulder, he blows out his knee, and from 75 to 77, he only plays 35 games. And yet, though, at the end of 77, he's a free agent. Now, he wants to stay in New York because he loves New York, and the New York fans love him and everything, but neither the Yankees nor the Mets will give him a contract that he's satisfied with. But Bill Veeck of the White Sox, for some reason, has this great faith in Ron Bloomberg that he's going to hit 30 home runs and be one of the answers for the White Sox. And he gives Bloomberg a 4-year, $600,000 guaranteed contract. Now, Bloomberg was only making about $45,000 with the Yankees, so that quadruples his salary and he guarantees it. And so what happens is that Bloomberg is probably, he says that he's about 70% healthy, which I would say was probably a lot less than that. And he has a moment or two early in the season where he hits a game-winning home run, but it soon becomes apparent that he is not the player that Veeck thought he was. And he's soon benched and used mainly as a DH. And So he retires at age 30. And Bloomberg says, I feel like I let myself down, the fans down, and it's really tough when you don't feel like you had an opportunity to find out how good you could have been. And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of these players might have shared, that they didn't get a chance to prove how good they thought they might have been. So anyway, those are some of the players I think who are interesting, and I think all of them have their own interesting stories. They all have their reasons why they might not have succeeded as well as people did. And I guess I will finish with talking a little bit about Bryce Harper, since he's an active player. And of course, we talk about pressure, and people ask me, well, who handled the pressure of being the next Mickey Mantle the best? And I say, without a doubt, it was Bryce Harper. He was built for pressure. He was geared for pressure. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated when he's 16 years old. But when he was 9 years old, he was playing with traveling teams of 13-year-olds, and they would travel to, like, he lived in Nevada, they would travel to Arizona, California, to different states to play games. And he'd play as many as 100. Although he was years removed from Mickey Mantle, his father was a big Mickey Mantle fan. And Bryce Harper says, Mantle's my favorite player. He said, I've watched him play on ESPN Classic quite a number of times, and I've modeled much of my game after Mantle. And when he was on the Nationals, he wore number 34. 3 + 4 = 7. And so, Harper was cocky at 15. He was cocky at 19. He's cocky today, but in a much more controlled way. We know about his competitiveness, and he's won 2 MVP awards. And this is interesting about Bryce Harper, is in his age 26 season, he had 184 home runs. When Mike Schmidt was in his age 26 season, he had 93 home runs. So Harper almost had twice as many home runs as Schmidt at age 26. Schmidt ended up with 548 home runs. Only 11 players had hit more home runs at age 26 than Harper, and seven of them are in the Hall of Fame. So Harper's projected to hit 520 some home runs. So he, with 2 MVPs and maybe another, in his future and whatever, he could be on his way to the Hall of Fame too. So Harper and Trout are the success stories for the players who were labeled the next Mickey Mantle. And players like Kirk Gibson and Bill Robinson, players like that were successful and had good careers, just maybe not to the extent that Harper and Trout have had. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, Barry.
Well, I just will let you know the title of the book again is The Search for the Next Mickey Mantle, from Tom Tresh to Bryce Harper. And they all have interesting stories, and I've tried to, as Peter said in the beginning, talk about the dynamic challenges that these players faced. And it's something that, as somebody said, this side of baseball hasn't been written about very often, to talk about the pressure and the expectations. So there's not much more pressure than being called the next Mickey Mantle. And Mantle, I just let you know, probably was under the most pressure, I think, of any player I can think of that, not only was he just 19 and he was a country boy, and I mean a country boy. He was a real hayseed. He goes to New York, media capital of the world. He's on the Yankees, the greatest team. The other thing, he's trying to replace Joe DiMaggio. The other thing that I didn't realize as much, and maybe a lot of other people don't realize as much, is how much animosity the fans had about Mantle because of his 4F status for the military. And matter of fact, Mantle went through 3 physicals, and each time was labeled 4F. And that didn't set too well with fans who said, look, if he can play Major League Baseball, why can't he serve in the military? The Korean War was going on at this time. And Mantle said, look, if I'm physically able and I'm okay, I'd be glad to join the military. But there was a contingent of fans who hated Mantle for that and continued to hate Mantle for that. Mantle, from age 19 to 23, was a big disappointment to the Yankees and to fans. And many of the media members said, Mantle's being shoved down our throat. We're being told how great he is. Well, what has he done? Well, he had won 1 home run title and had led the league in runs scored. And this was up till 1956. Now, in 1956, for the first time, he's healthy. And it's amazing how many writers predicted that he would win the MVP that year. And of course, he wins the Triple Crown. And to show you what type of pressure and the expectations were, one of the guys, a former Yankee, and I can't remember who it was, but he says about Mantle, he ought to be able to hit 80 home runs and bat 400. Now, you and I know that that's impossible. This is a guy who's a former major league player who played for the Yankees who's saying this. And so Bill Dickey says he's the greatest player I ever saw. So the question wasn't, was Mantle going to be a great player? Was he going to be the greatest player ever? So in 56, he wins the Triple Crown and he's MVP. And so you think that takes some of the pressure off of him, but no, the immediate conversation is that he ought to win the Triple Crown next year too. Well, nobody had ever done that, but they expected Mantle to do that.
Yeah.
So the pressure now, he wins the MVP in 57, but that just shows you the kind of pressure. And throughout his career, no matter what he did, people always thought he should have done more. And Casey Stengel and Mantle didn't get along all that well because Stengel resented the fact that Mantle wasn't dedicated to getting better. That as good as he was, Stengel knew he could have been better. And as we know about Mantle's nightlife and different things like that, he had shortcomings for sure in those areas. But so it took Mantle 5 years to become a superstar. And after he had been in the majors 4 years, Joe DiMaggio said, well, if he hasn't been if he's not a superstar by now, he probably never will be. But anyway, so
Hey.
I appreciate everybody.
Question, Barry?
Listening. Yes.
Is it?
Yeah.
And I missed a couple minutes, so I apologize if I missed this thing. When you were looking for comparisons or comparables, did you limit yourself only to center fielders? Or were these are guys that were labeled as the next Mickey Mantle. Kurt Gibson played right field, left field. I don't think he played center field very much. Let's see who else we got here. Yeah, Harper's mostly
Bloomberg. Bloomberg was certainly not a center fielder. He was a defensive liability, no matter where you put him.
So you're just saying that there weren't any infielders that got that label, perhaps because of the major difference in position?
Well, no, I think what they were doing is they were looking for 5-tool players. And if you now, Tom Tresh got compared to Mantle because he started out as a shortstop, which Mantle did.
Mhm.
They moved him to left field, and then he moved back to the infield. But that was almost the immediate comparison there. And of course, the media is looking for whatever they could to compare people.
Mhm.
On the, let's see, who else was I looking at here? And anyway, so yeah, it wasn't so much that like Bobby Mercer was an inevitable comparison because he was from Oklahoma. He
Mhm.
started as a shortstop. He came up to the Yankees at age 19. So he had those similarities. So anybody that had a slight similarity to Mantle was almost plugged into that.
Yep. Okay, thanks.
Okay, going once, going twice, going 3 times. Any questions?
Everybody seems pretty quiet.
Okay, well, it's been my pleasure. And if anybody wants to follow up, my email is bsparks243@aol.com. You could send me a question if you think of it later, or you have any other comments. I'd be glad to hear them. Thank you, everybody.
All right, guys, have a good evening. We'll see you all again soon. Enjoy the month of March.
All right.
Very
Thank you,
good.
Peter.
Good night.
See ya.
Yep, good night.